Welcome back to the class. We are starting the 7th week, and in this week we are looking into subaltern studies as a very powerful, important intervention in the study of Indian society. And strictly speaking, subaltern studies is not a sociological perspective. It was a historiographical intervention. Almost every scholar, maybe barring few, who contributed to subaltern studies, were historians and political scientists. But as students of sociology, as students of social sciences, it is important for us to have some familiarity with subaltern studies. So that is the reason why I decided to include this in our course on Indian society, and also because subaltern studies is one of the very few, maybe the only important path-breaking theoretical intervention, theoretical and conceptual intervention made into the study of Indian society. Okay, if you look into the myriads of theoretical frameworks used to study Indian society in modern social sciences, I am not talking about the other kind of approaches available in modern social sciences. Okay, subaltern studies is definitely one of the original contributions by scholars, Indian scholars mostly. Of course, they were based in many of the other places, but something that originated about India, and later it became a very important framework to look into the kind of post-colonial context. So on various counts, subaltern studies was a very important intervention. Maybe lasted for some 1.5–2 decades in its prime time before it started losing its steam. It was a very important intervention. So we are going to spend some time on that. So I basically planning to discuss a couple of review essays on subaltern studies. There are several essays that are written by scholars summarizing the basic arguments or critically reviewing the trajectory of the growth and trajectory of subaltern studies. So we will discuss one of them by Dibesh Chakravarti, followed by 2 classes which look at the subaltern studies project in a very critical manner, mostly from the Marxian scholarship. So these are some of the images of subaltern studies series, and let me tell you, it was founded by this scholar by name Ranajit Guha, who was a professor at Sussex University. So it emerged as an intervention from his side, an intervention into the historiography, which was made possible in his very important work titled The Elementary Aspects of Peasant Resurgency in Colonial India, which actually presented a very innovative intervention in historiography. And I hope you understand this word historiography. It's about the way in about the theoretically informed way in which you look at you study history. Okay, there are just like there are multiple perspectives within sociology. How do we approach history? What are the frameworks that you use to make sense of history are also subjected to so much of discussions and debates. So historiography is about the theoretical way in which one understands the history. So again, there are competing claims. There are Marxian historiography, there is nationalist historiography, there is Cambridge historiography. So there are so many. Again, it's a very vibrant field, just like any other vibrant social sciences. So this particular book, Elementary Aspects of Peasants' Insurgency in Colonial India, this publication of the book and the intervention of Ranajit Guha seemed to be a decisive moment. And later they published the first volume of Subaltern Studies, in which he had this introductory essay on some aspects of historiography of colonial India. This is the title of the essay that Guha wrote in the introductory chapter, and this becomes a kind of a manifesto for Subaltern Studies. And so Subaltern Studies basically was founded by Ranajit Guha and many of his students, some 6 or 7 of his own students, and later it attracted other scholars from across the globe and also from India Partha Chatterjee, then Gyanendra Pandey, and a host of other people. And later they were able to get on board sociologists, and then and political scientists, and then feminists, and people who work in literature on humanities and culture studies. Gayatri Chakravarti's Spivak, Homi Bhabha, a lot of people kind of came on board, and this continued. This Subaltern Studies they were able to publish different volumes, at least some 12 volumes of Subaltern Studies, and this is a list. The first one, edited by Ranajit Guha, came out in 1982, and almost, I think, till the 10th volume they were all published by Oxford University Press. And the second volume came in 83, 84, 85, 87, 89, 93, 94, and 93 onwards, Guha stepped down from the editorial position, and it was, then they shared the responsibility among the people, the core people who were involved, including Partha Chatterjee, Gyanendra Pandey, David Arnold, David Hardiman, Shahid Amin, Divesh Chakravarti, Gautam Badra, Gyan Prakash, Susi Tharu, Partha Chatterjee, Pradeep Jagannathan, and the final edited volume appeared in 2005 and edited by Shail Mayaram, M.S.S. Pandyan, and Ajay Skaria. That was published by Permanent Black and Devi Dayal Publisher. And with that, that series of Subaltern Studies ended. Okay, and the reason why it ended, and what were the criticisms, the kind of a trajectory that it took, because by the time in 2000, by the time the 12th volume came out, the very character of Subaltern Studies had undergone significant transformation. It was appropriated more into culture studies, into post-colonial, kind of theorization, into more postmodern kind of theoretical frameworks than a kind of very visible Marxist orientation that it had in the beginning. Because Ranajit Guha had a very strong Marxian leanings, though he quarreled with some of the orthodox ways in which Marxist historiography presented in a society. So that is something important. So let me just show you the major. So I am not using PowerPoint for this class. I am looking at a couple of essays. This is the essay that I am going to use for this class. I think I might require 2 sessions for this. Titled Subaltern Studies and Postcolonial Historiography by Divesh Chakravarti. It was published in 2000. Another very useful essay that I came across is Subaltern Studies as Postcolonial Criticism by Gyan Prakash, published much before 1994. Okay, so both these essays provide you with a very interesting summary and basic arguments about the whole book, but I decided to go with the first one, essay by Divesh Chakravarti. It's much more easily readable, much more accessible. So this is an essay published by Duke University Press, and let us go through these essays. I have highlighted important parts, and then you can, I think you all of you must be able to get hold of this essay. Subaltern Studies, writing on Indian history and society, began in 1982 as a series of interventions in the debates specific to the writing of modern Indian history. Ranajit Guha, the historian of India, then teaching at University of Sussex, was the inspiration behind it. We mentioned that. The intellectual reach of Subaltern Studies is now exceeded that of the discipline of history. Again, I told that though it was a historical intervention, it became a very important framework, was it got expanded into other disciplines, and also this theoretical framework was adopted by other social scientists to use in their respective countries. So postcolonial theorists of diverse disciplinary backgrounds have taken interest in the series. Much discussed, for instance, are the ways in which contributors of Subaltern Studies have participated in contemporary critique of history of nationalism and Orientalism and Eurocentrism in the construction of social science knowledge. And selections from the series have been published in English, Spanish, Bengali and Hindi, and are in the process of being brought out in Tamil and Japanese. So it's a very powerful intervention. Okay. Now Divesh Chakravarti is asking the question, how did a project which began as a specific and focused intervention in the academic discipline of Indian history came to be associated with postcolonialism? an area of study whose principal home has been the literature departments. So as I mentioned that maybe in the latter part of Subaltern Studies, it was taken over or heavily influenced by the post-colonial scholars, mostly the literature scholars like Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak and others, who were the scholars of cultural studies. They started using this framework very extensively. So this essay is motivated by question that the discipline of history in focus. In what ways can one read the original historiographic agenda of Subaltern Studies as not simply yet another version of Marxist radical history, but as possessing a necessarily post-colonial outlook? So he basically argues that the Subaltern Studies cannot be reduced to a Marxian, a conventional Marxian framework, but it had a kind of a post-colonial intent from the very beginning. I concentrate on the discipline of history for two reasons. The relationship between the new field of post-colonial writing and historiography has not yet received the attention it deserves. Okay, the connection between post-colonial writing and historiography has not been given sufficient attention. And to answer critics who say Subaltern Studies was once good Marxist history in the same way that the English tradition of history from below was, but that it lost its way when it came in contact with Said's Orientalism, Spivak's deconstructionism, or Baba's analysis of colonial discourse. So this point I think we will discuss more in detail when we take up the kind of a criticism. And when you look into the criticisms, the major criticisms against Subaltern Studies emerge from the Marxian scholars, Sumit Sarkar, then Chibber and others. So who were extremely critical of the latter turn of Subaltern Studies from a kind of Marxian framework into a more post-colonial, postmodern framework. So now this section, this Subaltern Studies and debates in modern Indian history, he locates the emergence of Subaltern Studies as a theoretical intervention in the history of Indian, the historiography of studying Indian society. So the basic story, if in a nutshell, it is that when Subaltern Studies emerged as an intervention, the major theoretical historiographical schools that existed was the Cambridge school, okay, that from scholars from the Britain, who enormously overemphasized the role of the empire, the role of the Britain in creating Indian national feelings, and then reduced everything to the Indian elites who use this the colonial enterprise for their selfish motive, and the nationalist historians, mostly combined with Marxian scholars, who presented a kind of a nationalist historiography, nationalist argument, saying that Indian people who fought for the independence were all inspired by a sense of nationalism, and that had nothing much to do with the kind of intellectual or ideological influence from the colonialism. Okay, and Guha finds both these arguments are problematic, because we will discuss that, but he found both these arguments problematic, and then he makes his very important and decisive intervention, finding fault with both the Cambridge school as well as the nationalist school. So this particular section, that is Subaltern Studies and Debates in Modern Indian History, traces that argument. So let us go through them quickly. I begin by sketching some of the principal debates in modern Indian history with early Subaltern Studies intervened. Okay, so he talks about, in the early phase, this area of scholarship bore all sign of an ongoing struggle between tendencies affiliated with imperialist biases in history and nationalist desire on the part of the historians in India to decolonize the past. Marxism was understandably mobilized in aid of the nationalist project of intellectual decolonization. So Marxian framework was used by the nationalist scholars to build up a narrative about the kind of a nationalist historiography that they wanted to present. So he talks about a series of works, A.R. Desai, Bipin Chandra, then D.L. Lowe and others, and many seminal articles published by Bernard Cohen, now collected in his book An Anthropologist Among Historians, so others, and debates around David Morris's assessment and others. So Now the whole question is, did the imperialist British deserve the credit after all for making India a developing, modern or united country? Were the Hindu-Muslim conflicts that resulted in the formation of two states of Pakistan and India consequence of the divide and rule policies of the British, or were they reflections of divisions internal to South Asian society? So some of the very the whole point is, once India got independent, then there were increased interest among the scholars to make sense of what had gone past, the whole colonial experience, the whole anti-colonial struggle, and the kind of a larger transformation that was happening in the Indian society. So this section, this particular paragraph is an elaboration of the Cambridge school, specifically by Anil Seal. The book, The Emergence of Indian Nationalism, pictured nationalism as the work of tiny elite reared in the education institutions the British set up in India. So this was the crux of the Cambridge school, who reduced Indian nationalism to the Indian elites who were the beneficiaries of a British education system and then modernity. So they argued that it was the penetration of the colonial state into the local structures of power in India, a move prompted by financial self-interest of the Raj rather than by any altruistic motives, that eventually and by degree drew Indian elites into colonial governmental processes. According to this argument, the involvement of Indians in the colonial institutions set off a scramble among the indigenous elites, who combined opportunistically and around factions formed along vertical lines of patronage to jockey for power and privilege within the limited opportunities of self-rule provided by the British. So such, Cambridge historians claimed, was the real dynamics of that which outside observer or native historians may have mistaken for an idealist struggle for freedom. Okay, so they reduced Indian freedom struggle. For example, what motivated Indians to go en masse for this freedom struggle? The Cambridge historians kind of belittled by saying that they were all kind of a residue of the colonial Raj, and a tiny Indian elites were interested, were impressed by or they made use of the opportunity provided by the Raj, and they were the one who were behind it. Okay, and on the other extreme of this debate was the Indian historian Bipin Chandra and from JNU, and a host of these national scholars who argued that, cutting across class and caste in India, there were a genuine sense of a yearning for freedom, a desire for freedom, and that was something intrinsic to Indian nationalism. Yeah, so however, Chandra saw nationalism as in different contrasting light. He saw it as a regenerative force, the antithesis to colonialism, something that united and produced an Indian people by mobilizing them for struggle against the British. Okay. Now, yet research progressed in the 70s. There emerged an increasing series of difficulties with both these narratives. So these were the two competing historiographical accounts. On the one hand, you have Cambridge historiography. On the other hand, you have a nationalist historiography making use of the Marxian framework. Now, later, when this was in progress, there emerged an increasing series of difficulties with both these narratives. It was clear that the Cambridge version of nationalist politics without ideas or idealism would never ring true to scholars in the subcontinent who had themselves experienced the desire for freedom from colonial rule. So the Cambridge historiography was kind of dismissed by Indian scholars, saying it as a very Eurocentric, ethnocentric dismissal of Indian experience. But on the other hand, the nationalist historian story, there having been a moral war between colonialism and nationalism, were increasingly thin as research by younger scholars in India and elsewhere brought new material to life. So what was the kind of a crisis that a nationalist historiography was facing? So nationalist historiography saw that there was a kind of increasing schism between the elites and the downtrodden people in India. Okay, or there were differences in the ways in which these people understood freedom or understood nationalism and then engaged with that. New information on mobilization of the poor, peasants, tribals and workers by the elite nationalist leaders in the course of the Gandhian mass movement in the 1920s and 30s, for example, suggested a strongly reactionary side to the principal nationalist party in the Indian National Congress. So this whole way in which how the people reacted to Indian National Congress and the agenda of Ahimsa and the principles of Mahatma Gandhi, it threw up quite a lot of uncomfortable scenarios. For example, I hope you know about this Chowri Chowra incident where the people turned violent and Gandhiji had to go on fast in protest or as a kind of a thing. So there was so much of dissonance within the nationalist group. Let us look into the way in which Subaltern Studies made entry into this particular point. Subaltern Studies intervened in this situation. Intellectually, it began on the very terrain it was to contest. Historiography that has had its root in the colonial education system. It started as a critique of the two contending schools of history, the Cambridge School and the nationalist historians. Both these approaches, declared Guha in a statement that inaugurated the series Subaltern Studies, were elitist. Okay, so he argues that both the Cambridge historians and the nationalist historians were representing an elitist view of Indian nationalism. Okay, both these frameworks really failed to understand how the masses experienced, visualized, internalized and expressed nationalism. They wrote up history of nationalism as the story of an achievement by the elite class, whether Indian or British. Okay, for their own merits, they could not explain the contributions made by people on their own, that is independent of elites, to the making and development of this nationalism. So, as you know, the history of independence in India, or the history of independence struggles in India, is a very long one, and it cannot be reduced to say a figure like Mahatma Gandhi or Jawaharlal Nehru or number of other, you know, these very important freedom struggles. Indian freedom struggle had a long history of violent uprisals against the British. Okay, almost every location of India saw violent uprisings of tribals, of farmers, of different kingdoms, different geographical people in different geographies taking up arms against British rule. Okay, now how do you understand that? And most of these these revolts were not violent. Okay, they did not really subscribe to the Gandhian idea of non-violence, and they did not really express the kind of a nationalism in the true sense. Okay, devoid of all caste or class or ethnic affiliations. They were all a mix of everything. It will be clear from the statement of Guha's that the Subaltern Studies was part of an attempt to align historical reasoning with the larger movement of democracy in India. So another important point is that, so now this is something similar to what was a very important intervention in the British historiography, that is the history from below. Okay, because conventionally history is seen as the story of the big people, story of the empires, story of the emperors, story of the kings, story of the people who build huge nations. But these Marxian scholars argued that a history from below, a history of the ordinary people, how they contributed into that, or how material factors, okay, affected, or material factors were important in the contributions of these ordinary people. So that was a major intellectual movement from Britain by including scholars like Hobsbawm and others to create this history from below. And this was also the time when which was heavily influenced by Antonio Gramsci's theoretical intervention, where he used this term subaltern and he used the term hegemony basically to theoretically explain, okay, how this sphere of culture is something important, and how people the people can be governed not only through brute force but also through very clear interventions in their realm of ideas. Okay, he talks about consent and coercive intervention, and then arguments of consent and others. So Gramsci emerged as a very important a theoretical figure in this whole thing. As Guha puts it once in the course of introducing volume Subaltern Studies, we are indeed opposed much of the prevailing academic practice in historiography for its failure to acknowledge the subaltern as the maker of his own history. This critique lies at the very heart of our project. So the basic project of Subaltern Studies was to show how the subaltern people, okay, subaltern people are the people at the bottom hierarchy of a society. They had their own agency, okay, they had their own on project political consciousness, and they were also actively participating. Okay, so things cannot be or must not be reduced to a handful of elites, Western educated or modern educated elites. Rather, the ordinary people, the tribals, the farmers, the workers, the Dalits, the Adivasis, they all had different kinds of autonomy. They all had their own kind of agency. But at the same time, Guha's theorization of the project signaled certain key differences that would increasingly distinguish the project of Subaltern Studies from the English Marxian historiography. With hinterland, so he talks about three major differences between history from below and Subaltern Studies. One is a relative separation of the history of power from any universalist history of capital. And the Marxian historiography is essentially a historiography modeled after Marxian analysis of the economic system. Okay, so it presents you, especially the modern history is presented as the history which is very closely connected with the history of capital, the transition from the feudal society to the modern society, and into a kind of a late capitalist era. So this is what the Marxian historiography looks into that. But what is presented here? So every I hope you remember the mode of production debate in the Marxian school that we discussed a couple of weeks ago. Okay, so a Marxian scholar would try to understand what is the role of capital. Okay, what was the kind of an economic transaction happened in India during feudal and semi-feudal and industrial mode of production. So was there a Asiatic mode of production? All these debates were very much important. But on the contrary, Subaltern Studies were not concerned with, or they did not want to tie every aspect of social change to transformation of the capital. And a critique of the nation form. Second one is also something very close to Subaltern Studies, is that it inherently had a critique of the nation form, nation state as the natural way of organizing people, and interrogation of the relationship between power and knowledge. Hence the archive itself and the history as a form of knowledge. Very, very important intervention by Edward Said, and then Antonio Gramsci brought out this very intricate relationship through which power and knowledge constitute each other. Okay, so the way in which, and that is why the archive itself became a very contested one, because archive really represents the views of the powerful. Okay, archives represents the views of the people who wrote about incidents and then who had the ability to record things. So archive itself is seen as not as a neutral place that offers you insights and information, but archive has to be critically analyzed as the way in which a particular kind of reality is presented. Okay, especially by the people who had the power to categorize, catalog, and describe and explain and then theorize things that happen in front of them. Very, very important set of arguments. So using people and subaltern classes synonymously and defining them as the demographic difference between the total Indian population and the dominant indigenous foreign elites, claimed that there was in colonial India an autonomous domain of the politics of the people. Guha argues that there was in colonial India an autonomous domain of politics of the people that was organized differently than the domain of the people, politics of the elite. Elite politics involved vertical mobilization, a greater reliance on Indian adaptation of British parliamentary institutions, and tended to be relatively more legalistic and constitutional in orientation. Okay, so Guha argues that the kind of a mobilization that was used by Indian elites were vertical in character, and they used the possibilities offered by the modern British Raj. Okay, the administrative interventions and other things that were kind of a vertical in its character. It was a more secular in its character. They tried to cut across the social categories and then tried to create the kind of a categories that cuts across social categories. On the other hand, in the domain of subaltern politics, on the other hand, mobilization for political intervention depended on horizontal affiliations such as traditional organizations of kinship and territoriality, or the class consciousness depending on the level of consciousness of the people involved. So the subaltern mobilization, according to Guha, organized on the basis of pre-existing forms of collectivities. Okay, because in India traditionally non-modern forms of collectivities are, say, the collectivities based on your kinship, ethnic group, ethnicity, caste, and certain kind of class consciousness which are very locally determined. So these primordial affiliations, okay, affiliations that are given to you by birth, the ethnic, the kinship, the caste, and the linguistic things, the tribal affiliations, these were all seen as pre-modern by the Marxist scholars. They are not seen as modern enough. They were seen as insufficiently political, okay. But the Subaltern Studies scholars vouched by the authenticity of that. They tended to be more violent than elite politics, okay. Central to subaltern mobilization was a notion of resistance to elite domination. So peasant uprisings in colonial India, he argued, reflected this separate and autonomous grammar of mobilization. Is in its most comprehensive form. Even in the case of resistance and protest by urban workers, the figure of mobilization was one that derived directly from peasant insurgency. So his work, this elementary forms of peasant insurgency, Guha's work is such kind of an intervention. Guha's separation of elites and subaltern domains of the political had some radical implications for social theory and historiography. The standard tendency in global Marxist historiography until the 70s was to look on peasant revolt organized along the axis of kinship, religion, caste, etc. as movements exhibiting backward consciousness, and the kind of that Hobsbawm and his work on social banditry and primitive rebellion had called pre-political. Okay, it's a very, very important term. So again, I hope you remember that typical of a Marxian framework. For Marx, the reality was your class position, okay, your connection with the means of production, and that actually defines your social existence. And for Marx, religion was a false consciousness, or any other kind of social system was a false consciousness, because according to Marx, all these things are temporary. All these things will disappear, and your identity existence will be defined solely on the basis of your relations to the means of production. Okay, so that is why these pre-modern affiliations like kinship and then caste and tribal affiliations were typically defined in the Marxian historiography as pre-political. Okay, they are not yet come to the political world, they are not yet politically conscious, they are in a pre-political world. And this was seen as a consciousness that had not quite come to terms with the institutional logic of modernity or capitalism. So yeah, so this was a very important assumption to which the Subaltern Studies people took issue with. So Guha was prepared to suggest that the nature of collective action against exploitation in colonial India was such that it effectively stretched the imaginary boundaries of the category of political far beyond the territories assigned to in it by European political thought. So Guha basically took issue with this characterization of this kind of a politics as pre-political, and then argued that the very position of their subalternity, okay, the very stance of their subalternity defines their character of politics in this particular way, and to call it as pre-political would be off the mark, and to ignore the problems that the peasants' participation in the modern political sphere could be caused as a Eurocentric Marxism would lead, according to Guha, only to elitist histories. So these were the major criticisms that or major issues that Guha and his students took with the the Marxian historiography. Guha insisted that instead of beginning an anachronism in modernizing global world, the peasant was a real contemporary colonialism and a fundamental part of the modernity that colonial rule gave rise to India. The peasant was not a backward consciousness, a mentality left over by the past, baffled by the modern political and economic situations, and yet resistant to them. Okay. So Guha suggested that the insurgent peasant in colonial India did in fact read his contemporary world correctly. So it is a way in which we try to make sense of how the subalterns reacted during that particular time, not to attach tags to them, not to label them as pre-political, not to label them as people with false consciousness, but try to understand why they behaved the way they behaved. So in all these arguments, he examining, for example, over 100 known cases of peasant rebellion in India between 1783 and 1900. Guha showed that these revolts always involved deployment by the peasants of code of dress, speech and behavior which tended to invert the codes through which their social superiors dominated them in their everyday life. So Guha is bringing in their situation as subaltern, okay, who are dominated by another sections of Indian population to the fore. Okay, so when you talk about the peasants, especially the small scale peasants and the landless laborers and the Dalits and or Adivasis, you are treating them as people who are dominated by another section of society, and that is what actually defines their subalternity. I emphasized the word political in this quote from Guha to create a tension between Marxist lineage of subaltern studies and more challenging questions it raised from the very beginning about the nature of power. The tension between a familiar narrative and of capital and a more radical understanding of it can be seen in elementary aspect itself. There are times when Guha tends to read the domination and subordination in terms of an opposition between the feudal and the capitalist mode of production. Okay, because as I mentioned, Guha was a Marxian scholar, but later wanted to go into more sophisticated analysis. So there is a respectable tendency of in Marxists or liberal scholarship to read undemocratic relationship or personalized systems of authority and practices of deification as survival of a pre-capitalist era as not quite modern. So this was again a tendency of Marxian scholarship, and which some kind of an evidence you can also see in Guha's own writing. So I think we have come halfway through this essay. We'll take a short break, and then the remaining part I will explain in the next class.